Hey guys, welcome to the Student Side Hustle. So in this show, what we're trying to do is I'm trying to share stories of individuals and people who generally are doing something unique, doing something entrepreneurial, doing something that they're passionate about and trying to make it their career. That's not necessarily the thing that allows you to be on the show or qualifies you to be a guest on the show, but that's generally what we're talking about. We're talking about entrepreneurship, passion, etc. A lot of it revolves around bodybuilding and fitness because that's what I'm personally interested in. But what I want you to take away from this is just the fact that you can do whichever passion that you'd like to do, and you can make that into a career. It's a long path, but you can make it happen. And basically what I'm doing is showing you 80 plus examples of people who are doing it and who have done it. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I would love if you would subscribe because we've got a lot of new episodes coming out. And yeah, thank you so much for listening.
People are constantly raising the bar.
Sacrifices need to be made.
What would you guys say are your biggest weaknesses?
You or your enemy right now?
The success of life.
Just a fucking podcast.
Hey guys, welcome to the Student Side Hustle. This week I'm speaking to Alex Kolari Turner. He is a PhD student at the University of Brighton. He's doing his PhD on anabolic steroids' effect on muscle gene expression, epigenetic markers, and muscle memory. So, Alex, what is all this research about and how did you get into this?
So I have been a PhD student now for 2 years at the University of Brighton in England. If you don't know where Brighton is, it's just south of London by the seaside in the UK. And our research is focusing on, as you said, the question of what is the effects of anabolic steroids on muscle gene expression, epigenetic markers, and their influence on muscle memory in humans. And James has invited me onto this podcast as I'm currently recruiting participants for our research at the moment. Our next sample dates are on the 16th and 17th of March. It's a Saturday and a Sunday. And the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th of April, and that's a Saturday, Sunday, Monday. And essentially anyone who is, and we're looking for four groups of males, aged 20 to 35. Everyone that comes and visits the lab will have to visit for roughly 3 hours, and all travel expenses are covered. And we are looking for 4 groups. The first group is control groups, so sedentary males, so guys that don't lift any weights. The second group is a group of males who resistance train regularly for 8 hours a week. The third group is a group of males who resistance train for that same amount of time, but they are currently using or have just recently concluded an anabolic steroid cycle. So when they come to the labs, they've just finished taking an anabolic steroid cycle of a minimum of 20 weeks, and they will then be sampled, and then that group of individuals will then stop taking anabolic steroids, and they will cycle off. So they will in their own time conduct a post-cycle therapy, a PCT, to kickstart their own internal production again, and then they will then go off cycle, and then we will resample them again in 20 weeks time. And then the fourth and final group are guys that used to take anabolic steroids 2 to 4 years ago, but since then have been drug-free.
Right.
And this is the first time in the literature that we're going to have a chronological monitoring of what happens to a group of guys who have just finished taking steroids and then they go off steroids. So we're going to get a very good measure of how much muscle mass guys have built after a steroid at the conclusion of their cycle, and then how much muscle mass can they maintain or do they lose while they go off steroids, and at the same time have a comparison point and that group is then sort of continued on, but with different people as a comparison point for guys who took steroids 2 to 4 years ago but are currently drug-free. As you can imagine, the ethical approval for these kinds of studies is very difficult, which is why we're sampling people after they've finished taking steroids and then they no longer take them. So at the point of sampling, no one is actually taking any anabolic steroids, which is how you can get research done on anabolic steroid users, because that's incredibly difficult.
Yep.
And at the same time, we will be collecting blood, urine, and saliva, and we'll be measuring their muscle mass with a bod pod, a bioimpedance scale, and research-grade skin fold calipers to get body fat percentage. So the guys that have just finished their cycle will get a snapshot of how much muscle mass they have, and then we'll get an indication of how much muscle mass somebody has, and then what happens 20 weeks later. So how much have they lost or maintained, and then we would like. And at the same point, we're conducting muscle biopsies, and we're conducting muscle biopsies of the trapezius muscle. I've had the muscle biopsy in the process of this research, and it's not that painful. There's a pressure sensation involved. But it's no more than someone digging their thumb into your back. You're under local anesthetic, and the muscle biopsy is divided in two. So one half we'll be looking at the gene expression inside the muscle, as well as epigenetic markers on the DNA, and that's never been done before in a human anabolic steroid user, so that'll be the first time. So we'll get a very concise picture at the molecular level, what anabolic pathways are upregulated, and then do they remain upregulated after anabolic steroids are removed from the system, and what are they like when someone hasn't taken steroids for 2 to 4 years compared to our comparison groups of no steroid using resistance trained males and controls who don't lift weights. And then the other half of the muscle biopsy is frozen in liquid nitrogen, and that will be looked at under the microscope to see how big the muscle fiber is, and how many nuclei does it contain, how many stem cells does it contain, how many capillaries does it contain, what fiber type is it, etc. So a standard battery of microscopy tests. And so, for example, some of the guys that we have recruited, they just happen to be cycling off anabolic steroids around the time the sampling is taking place. And then they are going off cycle because they want to get their partners pregnant, or they are just taking a break from anabolic steroids. And so at the same time, they're going to get a metric of how much muscle mass they managed to maintain or lose during that time period, and get a measurement of how much they built when they were on a cycle.
Right.
We obviously do not influence at any point what drugs somebody takes, or anything along those lines. We don't have an influence. This is a 100% observational study, and you're only required to visit the labs once unless you're in the group that returns twice. And we are reimbursing people's travel for this, and we are willing to cover somebody's flights and one night's accommodation from anywhere in the United Kingdom and potentially even Europe. And that's something that we can have a discussion about. So if you're interested, I have made a post I've made a separate Instagram account for this. It's what people tend to use most at the moment. And if you search for Alex_K_T, you'll find the advertisement for this study. You can find everything that I've just said there in summary. And then you can get in contact with me. You can find my academic email there. And so Alex_K_T, and then essentially get in touch with me. And then if you're genuinely interested in taking part in the research, then I can have a discussion with you about organizing your visit in March or in April. However, if you're listening to this after the fact and it's too late to get involved, but you really want to, still do get in touch, because we have new sampling dates organized all the time. And I'll just note down your contact information and then touch base with you once I have new dates. And if you genuinely find that scientific research on steroid users is cool, but you don't live in Europe and you can't take part, I'd just greatly appreciate it if you shared this information on your social media, as currently that's been our most successful format of getting participants within the current and past using group, which is obviously logistically the hardest group to find. And I will conclude just the discussion on this study just by saying that anonymity is guaranteed. No one will know what group you're in except me. And once you come into the labs and we do your paperwork and we have a discussion of your cycles, current cycle and previous cycles, depending on what group you're in, you're given a unique identification number. And then there is just no carryover from your name to that new identification number. And everything is anonymized at that point.
Fantastic.
So I think the best thing, as we said before, James, was to sort of discuss a little bit about why we want to conduct this research and what we hope to find and investigate.
Yeah, so what are the practical sort of outcomes of this? Where can this be applied, and then why? Yes,
so I think to answer that question, we have to have a fundamental understanding of how muscle growth occurs, to better understand what we're looking for and why we're deciding to recruit the groups that we're interested in. And so muscle fibers, you can imagine them as cylinders, and these are cylinders that contain contractile proteins, and these proteins slide past each other, and that's what results in a muscular contraction. But the interesting thing about muscle fibers is they are, by volume, the largest cells inside the human body. So, for example, in the sartorius muscle, which is at the front of your thigh and it goes across your quadricep, a single muscle fiber can be 23 inches long, and so that's a massively large cell. And so most people, when they've studied biology, would imagine that a cell has a single nucleus, and the nucleus of the cell is controls what the cell does. This is a very basic level, and also is involved in making proteins for the cell. But for example, your liver only has one nucleus per cell, but muscle fibers, because they have such a huge volume, they actually are multinucleated, and so they contain thousands of nuclei inside them, and these nuclei are responsible for making proteins. And so when you resistance train and when you consume protein, you stimulate those nuclei inside those muscles to make proteins. And through time, if protein synthesis is higher than protein breakdown, muscle hypertrophy occurs. But the thing with these nuclei is that they don't divide. So the only way you can increase the number of nuclei inside your muscle fibers is by activating the stem cells inside your muscle fibers. They're called satellite cells.
Right.
And through intense training, you can activate these satellite cells, and they will then donate they will divide in two, and one cell will donate its nucleus into the muscle fiber, so you now have more nuclei inside your fiber.
Yep.
And then the other cell will remain as a stem cell and mean that the stem cell pool doesn't decline through time.
Right.
And so there's then two mechanisms growth can occur. You can stimulate the nuclei that are already present to make proteins, and you can also incorporate more nuclei into the fiber. And the more nuclei you can get into the fiber, the bigger the fiber will become.
Yeah.
And there's actually regarded that there's actually a ceiling where if you want your muscle fiber to surpass a certain size, you actually have to have nuclei go inside. And there's been some studies in humans where there's been a threshold proposed where growth beyond a certain percentage, the only way that growth occurs is via myonuclei getting incorporated from these stem cells, these satellite cells donating their nuclei inside. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing is that when you experience an atrophying condition, so when you are experiencing muscle loss, say because you're immobile, or in mouse models, the way this is studied is they actually will elevate their legs, and then the mouse cannot walk around, and if its legs are not being used, then there's no stimulation of protein synthesis, or much less stimulation of protein synthesis because the muscles are not being used. So protein breakdown outweighs protein synthesis, muscle loss occurs. You could also inhibit muscle being used and contracted by injecting the mouse with a nerve toxin that will block the nervous supply to the muscle. Again, the muscle doesn't contract, so you lose muscle mass. And you could also cut off the nerve supply to the muscle. Again, the muscle's not contracting, so no protein synthesis, muscle size decreases. And what they realized in a groundbreaking experiment they conducted in the University of Oslo is where in both of those three situations, so hind limb suspension, a chemical nerve block, and physical nerve being cut, that and what they did was they imaged the nuclei inside a single muscle fiber prior to that condition and then during that condition. So the exact same fiber, they cut the mouse open, looked at the fiber, sewed the mouse up, cut off the nervous supply to their muscle, cut the mouse back open, looked at the nuclei again, closed the wound, and then looked at the nuclei again at a later time point. And essentially what was discovered was that even if the fiber as a cylinder decreases in size because less protein synthesis is occurring, so there's less proteins inside the fiber, so it gets smaller, the nuclei that were incorporated into that fiber do not go anywhere. Right. And those nuclei, in theory, can then enhance your rate of muscle growth later down the line. Yeah. And that same group conducted a quite a famous study now in mice, where they exposed the mice to anabolic steroids, and they experienced an increase in muscle mass and an increase in nuclei accumulation. Right. And then when they took them away from anabolic steroids, they lost muscle mass, but their muscle mass actually went back down to the same level as the control group. Yep. But the number of nuclei remained elevated. Right. And then when they exposed those mice to a hypertrophic stimulus, in this case they used a classic technique in mice where they will actually cut one muscle off and so the mice is then forced to walk around on another muscle.
Yep.
And then that's a hypertrophic stimulus because of just the resistance exposure. That muscle then grew quicker in the group that were previously exposed to anabolic steroids than the group that were not previously exposed to anabolic steroids. And so anabolic steroids in that way could be regarded as an enhancing muscle memory.
Right.
But this sort of goes and makes sense evolutionarily, because if you were to accumulate muscle mass, say in a season where food availability was very good, and you were building shelters and you were building things and moving around a lot, it would make sense that you had a high amount of muscle mass. But then say you went into a period of famine, you then lost that muscle mass, but then it would then benefit you in evolutionary terms if you regained that muscle mass quicker a second time round. And so that's why it's understood that these myonuclei that get incorporated remain. And so you can incorporate myonuclei via the stimulation of satellite cells via training, but anabolic steroids also have the ability, once they have bound to their receptor, their androgen receptor inside the satellite cells, they can activate the satellite cell and then cause myonuclei accumulation to occur. And so if you resistance train and use anabolic steroids, your myonuclei numbers go up.
Right.
So the question of our research is, do myonuclei numbers decline through time from those individuals that have exposed themselves to anabolic steroids? For us to study muscle memory in humans in terms of the decay rates of myonuclei numbers. And that has an impact, like you requested. What's the impact? An impact in regards to how long do myonuclei numbers remain after anabolic steroid usage in humans? We don't know the answer to that question yet. The best guess you have, if you read some of the lead researchers in this group, particular Christian Gunderson, he's the guy that heads the lab out of Oslo that did a lot of the research I just mentioned, and he has a fantastic review paper on this topic. So if you just search in PubMed, Christian Gunderson and muscle memory, and he cites some literature in that review paper that says that the best guess we currently have is that the myonucleus inside a human lasts for 15 years. Because they've done a biopsy of somebody's diaphragm who was exposed to nuclear radiation, and from the decay rates of that nuclear radiation inside the nuclei, they estimate that nucleus is 50. And there's some problems with that because that study only involved 2 men, and it was a diaphragm muscle. And we don't know at what point that nucleus was incorporated into the muscle, so it might have been incorporated 15 years ago. But we don't know. That might be a new myonucleus. There could be some 40 or 50-year-old ones in there, but the ones that came up in the test were only 15 years old.
Right.
And then this also has implications not only in terms of steroid usage, but also for the aging population, because as you get older, the number of satellite cells, the number of stem cells inside your muscle decline. And that is regarded as one reason as to why muscle growth is much harder as you age. Not only does your testosterone levels decline through time, but you will lose satellite cells inside your muscle. So you lose the propensity for nuclei accumulation. So you lose the ability to build muscle. And sarcopenia is the disease of an age-associated decline in muscle. And that affects a lot of people globally and is regarded as a burden on national health services because as old people lose muscle mass through time and they become immobile and they increase the likelihood of falls and hip fractures, they then become very difficult to look after and care for, and they lose their independence if they have a fall, which is then a problem.
Damage of one fall, like I think the risk is something like 1 in 6 falls result in injury, or 1 in 6 falls might even result in fracture. I don't have a.
And then you take away someone's independence if they're elderly and they have a heavy hip, and that's not good for their mental health. It's not good for their physical health if they become bedridden. And obviously the amount of care that person then has to have increases, and then that economically has a burden on the health system. And that, but in theory, may have been avoided if their level of muscle mass was higher. And so if we know as a mechanism that the number of satellite cells that you have through time declines, then it might make sense that you resistance train while you're younger while your pool of satellite cells is high, to incorporate as many nuclei inside your muscle as possible,
Right.
to provide you a buffer as you enter old age so that you can enter with as much muscle mass as you possibly can. So your protein synthetic rate is as highest as it possibly could be with the content of myonuclei that you have,
Right.
to buffer yourself against sarcopenia and the inevitable age-related decline in muscle mass. And I think it's something like, if you don't resistance train regularly past the age of 40, you just lose 1% of your muscle mass every year. I believe. I just have to double check, but there's statistics like that out there that you can read in published literature.
No, I think that's what I've heard as well.
Yes. So I mean, muscle memory it has its importance in that regard as well.
Yeah.
Yes, and more than just bodybuilding.
It'd be hard when you first think of it to see why it can apply to things outside of that. But it's like, for instance, to my knowledge, muscle mass is a pretty good predictor of lifespan or just general health. It's like, for the most part, would you agree with the statement? Adding more muscle mass is going to make you more healthy to a point, obviously.
To a point, yes. And if you can enter old age and be healthy and injury-free and have a high level of muscle mass, then it will just increase the likelihood that you will maintain your physical independence, which is something that you obviously want to have as you get older.
Yes.
So we're obviously a lot of what I've mentioned there is in terms of myonuclei accumulation and retention, and the question of whether or not do they decay through time. We don't know if myonuclei decay through time in humans. That's for sure. And our study is simply an observational one in terms of looking at an experimental model where we know myonuclei accumulate, because we know that's what happens when people take steroids.
Yep.
And then what we want to know is, do they decline through time? That's essentially what we're investigating. But for the first time, as I mentioned before, because we're storing the muscle inside genetic material, we're also going to be investigating what happens in terms of anabolic pathways inside the muscle. So what, at gene expression level, what transcripts are upregulated, what ones are downregulated, and also what regions of the DNA are open and closed.
So what would be
because the way the steroid receptor works is that once the steroid binds to the androgen receptor in the cell, it moves into the nucleus and it binds to certain regions of DNA called androgen response elements. And then what would be fantastic to know is what regions of DNA are open, and then before that protein gets made, you need to have RNA being made and gene transcripts, and the question is what gene transcripts are being made in a human muscle that's been exposed to steroids for 20 weeks. We don't know the answer to that question yet, so at least our group is not aware of that in the scientific literature at the moment, and so that would be amazing if we could investigate that. And that's a very unique aspect of this research as far as I know. So what were you going to say? I interrupted you.
So what would be the practical implications of that as well? So how would that apply to either the everyday population or even the bodybuilding population?
So, I mean, you might find that certain transcripts are upregulated in this steroid user's muscle that are not. Anabolic steroids might be causing muscle growth via different mechanisms in steroid users compared to naturals.
Right. Okay.
You might find that different steroids upregulate different transcripts to other steroids because they all interact with the androgen receptor slightly differently. They might cause it to bind to slightly different regions of the DNA. That would, in humans, that'd be interesting to know. And there's been there's two quite interesting research papers in that regard. There was one that's not been published, although you can find it online, where they looked at the muscle proteome of previous users of anabolic steroids, and the proteome just means all of the proteins that were inside the muscle. And they found that guys that were current and past users of anabolic steroids actually had different proteins inside their muscle compared to guys that don't. And that's quite interesting. So that means that steroids are causing some sort of upregulation of these pathways, and that's not happening in guys that don't take them. So that's just interesting to know.
It's not like you've taken the exact same kind of muscle and replicated it. It's like there's actually something changing inside the muscle.
There's something changing, yes. And also, I don't know how much you know about mTOR, but it's basically the master regulator of protein synthesis inside the muscle cell. So the aim is, so this is when people will say, like Eric Helms and stuff, and guys will say, you need to consume a meal that's high quality protein source that contains over 3 grams of leucine 4 times a day. At least 30-40 grams of protein. That's because that amount of protein and that leucine content is, from what we know in research, stimulates mTOR to cause protein synthesis to go up inside your muscle. So mTOR is the master regulator of this is very basic level, but the master regulator of protein synthesis inside the cell. So if you stimulate mTOR, then protein synthesis occurs in the muscle, which is what you want if you want to build muscle, because you want protein synthesis to be elevated during the day, so it outweighs breakdown, and hence through time mass accumulates. And what a very recent study that was done last year, they actually inhibited mTOR inside mice, and they gave them nandrolone as an injectable anabolic steroid. And even though they inhibited the master regulator of protein synthesis inside the cell, mTOR, the mice still experienced muscle growth. Right.
So then there might be another mechanism we don't know about.
So there might be another pathway inside muscle in which anabolic steroids can cause growth. So if in the control groups there, if you inhibit mTOR and muscle mass doesn't grow much, if you inhibit mTOR and then give them steroids, the muscle still grows. So there might be a redundancy in the muscle where muscle growth is still possible without mTOR. Right. And anabolic steroids then allow that pathway to manifest itself. Right. And that needs to be further investigated.
So then we can look at the practical implications
our studies, we can look at the practical implications of that, because you might find a different way at the molecular level in which muscle grows, which just enhances our knowledge of muscle hypertrophy, which can only ever be a good thing, not only for the sarcopenic populations, but for the, bodybuilder enthusiast. It can benefit just our knowledge on the growth of mammalian muscle, which is only a good thing. Our study is never going to be able to answer that question, but I'm just saying that's an interesting finding of the kind of unknowns that are involved in how anabolic steroids increase muscle mass. Right. Yeah. And so there are some questions and some unknowns in that regard, and so our project will only help shed light on that question. And unfortunately, that our project is observational, because we are observing men who are taking steroids and what happens to them when they go off steroids, and guys who used to take steroids. I mean, we're not controlling their nutrition, we're not controlling their food or their lifestyle, and so the study obviously has got some problems, like all observational studies have. But in terms of research groups wanting to dedicate the time to investigate how anabolic steroids cause muscle growth, in terms of what anabolic pathways in terms of gene expression are being upregulated, what regions of the DNA are being opened, that's the epigenetic question, and then what happens to myonuclei loss in humans. It's not very common, it's not research that's done by lots of groups, so it's a very unique project, but you will never really be able to give people anabolic steroids in a research setting. It has been done in the past. It's very difficult to do, especially with high dosages take for bodybuilding purposes, because ethically that can be quite difficult. And so the best way for this kind of research to occur at the moment anyway is observational. It would be incredible if we could have the ethical clearance, the time, the money, the funding, the logistical feasibility to be able to give a group of untrained men anabolic steroids and a controlled nutrition and training program. Like, imagine they went to a camp somewhere and you had 2 groups of control, non-control. You controlled every aspect of their lifestyle and their nutrition and training over a very long period of time, monitored their health to make sure that nothing adverse occurred, and observed the increase in muscle growth, and then took them off training, and then investigated what the changes that happen at the molecular level in terms of the decline in anabolic pathways, what happens to myonuclei, etc., etc. But that's unfortunately never going to happen. At least I would be incredibly surprised if that did happen. And So the best thing we can do at the moment is observational research, in my opinion, anyway. Unless if someone out there is doing that, my word, get in touch because I'd love to know what you find.
Hopefully that would be. I think that's the only issue with this sort of research is it's sort of very hard to get things that aren't observational forward, which obviously sucks, but there's obviously reasons for that, and it's like it'd be great if 200 or maybe 1,000 men or maybe even 100 would put their hands up and say, hey, give me steroids and I'll be fine with it. And then maybe that would have... Yeah. But it's sort of... Yeah. Yeah.
And this is why you do research in animals, because you can control every aspect of their day, their food, the hypertrophic stimulus you experience them to. Everyone gets the same amount of steroids.
Yes.
And that research happens over a period of months, not years. And it's just quicker and far more controlled and gives us an idea of what happens that we then try our best to then further investigate in humans.
And then we'll get into... Is there anything else you'd like to touch on in regards to the study?
No, I think that's everything that we are really looking for.
Sounds good.
And
cool.
Yeah, and if you have any further questions, then
cool. So
we can go from there.
One thing I would like to touch on is harm reduction. So we noted before the podcast that, I don't know if we had the specific statistic available, but we noted that steroid usage in the UK has had a 4-fold increase in the last year or so, was it? And then...
Yes. Well, so there's been some national surveys that have been conducted over the past couple of years, so around 2017, and the sort of takeaway headline statistic that was put in all of the tabloid papers and other newspapers was that people self-declaring their usage of anabolic steroids. So obviously this is a survey, so you're not getting everyone, and people are self-declaring it. So maybe not everyone is admitting that. And it went up from 16 to 24-year-olds from 0.1% to 0.4%. So that's a 4-fold increase. And they estimated that meant another 19,000 young men were using anabolic steroids in the United Kingdom over that time frame. But some people say that could be an underestimation. But irrespective of numbers, or as a general trend over the past 5 years, people that study patterns of steroid usage would say yes, it has increased.
And then when it comes to harm reduction, from your point of view, what would you say are the main things that we should focus on if someone's going to take steroids? How should they do them? What sort of precautions should they take?
So there's many things that somebody should be doing, and there's many things that I think should be spoken about and made public, because more people are using these drugs, and we need to educate people to how, if they decide to use them via the mantra of harm reduction, use them in a safer way. And education is the forefront of that. The first thing that anyone should do if they're ever interested in taking anabolic steroids is think long and hard about that decision and the ramifications that occur, and educate themselves on how the drugs work, how you take them, the kind of dosages that are realistic for someone of their training age and experience. How is all other aspect of their training and nutrition 100% on point? And have they been dedicated enough to their training and nutrition for a period of time and years that this is the path that they want to walk down, and they're not using them for a quick, quote unquote, quick fix, but they are using them in an educated, calculated manner to work towards specific goals, and they have also weighed up the potential side effects that can occur. Because anabolic steroids, as a general rule of thumb, the higher the dosage you take and the longer you take them for, the higher the statistic likelihood that you're exposed to adverse side effects that compound through time and can result in medical conditions. So some of the things that are common issues that occur would be that first thing is that you have to understand that anabolic steroids are going to shut down your own internal production of testosterone if you take them for long enough, and that means you have to make an educated decision about what you want to do about when you decide to stop taking them. And you need to have a plan, because if you go off, be very low, you'll feel and experience the a low testosterone environment as a man, low libido, fatigue, etc., which is very uncomfortable, and that might result in you then using anabolic steroids, continuing to use them. So you make sure you understand that you're either going to have to go on a TRT dosage, or you're going to conduct post-cycle therapy and kickstart your own internal production again, and then rely off that in the future.
And one note on post-cycle therapy. I don't know if you've heard my podcast with Dean St. Mark.
With Dean,
Yep.
yes, he essentially has some very good content on how the best to conduct post-cycle therapy, because as he says in that podcast, the book that everyone should be reading if they were interested in anabolic steroids, the book Anabolics by William Llewellyn and The Power PCT by Dr. Mike Scally, just as a general blanket statement in that book, says 2 weeks after your last injection, start your PCT. You should actually monitor your testosterone and work out the decay rates and half-lives of the drugs you're taking. So if you're injecting long-acting esters, then you're going to have to wait a longer time for that drug to clear your system, for your testosterone to flatline, and then you then start kicking internal testosterone back up again to avoid the conflicting information of you're trying to kickstart your internal production and still having the drug circulating in your system. So you definitely. So I mean, you've got to be fully clued up on that and already have a plan in mind of are you doing a PCT or are you cruising, and fully know the time frame and have those drugs on hand if you're deciding to do that, and at the same time be monitoring your testosterone levels of blood work so you know. So the exit plan is the number one. There's some published researchers called Harrison Pope and Gen Kanayama, and they've done surveys in America. And they estimate that potentially up to 30% of guys become dependent on anabolic steroids because everyone. I mean, we're talking about bad things here, but as anabolic steroids work, they increase your muscle mass and enable you to recover faster. And if that's what you're interested in, then you will receive that if all other things and your lifestyle, nutrition, training, sleep, etc., are taken into account and are on board. But they say that some of the reason why some guys become dependent is because they don't manage what they do post-cycle very well, and they experience their low testosterone, and so they then go back to using to mitigate that feeling. And at the same time, they also are taking anabolic steroids to increase their muscle mass, and then they don't like losing muscle mass afterwards, and so they might then continue using because they don't want to see declines in muscle mass. So you almost need to be mature enough to say, well, if I'm experiencing adverse side effects and I'm losing muscle mass, I should probably take my health as my priority and not my body image as my priority. Those lines then become blurred if your job is your body image. But you need to, as a general rule of thumb, I don't think it would be incorrect to say that you would need to be able to separate your body image from your health. And be very conscious that those lines don't get blurred and that your body image outweighs your health. So, I mean, you can't get addicted like you can get addicted to, heroin. It's not. There's no physiological dependence to the drug, but there may be a psychological dependence to the muscle mass that you build. And then if you experience a low hormonal environment afterwards, then that might also then make you go back to using. So you need to be
like
very.
Everything was better on it. And
So then
muscle mass is better.
I mean, they'll give you everything you want. If you're interested in bodybuilding, but then you've got to be very, very careful about how you are going to deal with it once you can't, or you take a break from using them.
Do you have any other places you'd recommend looking for decent advice on PCT and places like that? Obviously, Dean's a good start, but then is there anywhere else?
Dean's aren't. I mean, the book Anabolics by William Llewellyn is basically the encyclopedia of anabolic steroids. And he has a website, anabolics.org, and you can get a lot of his stuff for free. I mean, you can buy his book on Amazon, and it's cheap. You can buy it in hardback as well, but I mean, that contains a lot of good information. And there are obviously now, quote unquote influencers that talk about the appropriate ways to take anabolic steroids, but even then you've got to be very careful because there is misinformation. There is misinformation.
For instance, I'll type him in chat. This guy, like I've seen this guy repeatedly say, and I don't know if you know TM Cycles, he sort of called him out. And if you know TM Cycles and you follow him, you probably know what I'm talking about now. But
I've explained my project to Tom, and he shared it on his social media.
It's like so, I mean, that guy just said bad things about certain things, and
Yeah. So, I mean, in general rule of thumb is just be very careful about what advice you take from social media influencers, period. And then if you're taking advice on using exogenous hormones, be very careful. And you should spend the time to read up on them yourself. And, Dr. Mike Scally is got fantastic information on PCT. William Llewellyn also has information as well, the guy of the Anabolics book. I'd just be, educate yourself first. Educate yourself on. Also, you're going to have to be very. Going back to some of the comments. So I started with saying internal testosterone goes down, so you need to have an exit plan. Very clued up on that. Also, anabolic steroids. If you, in all these things, it's the more you take and the higher dose you take, likelihood of what I'm mentioning occurs. So if you and also it depends on your genetics. Some people might not even experience these, but if anabolic steroids, so that's why you would have to say anabolic steroids can increase blood pressure, and in some people that can happen instantly. Some people it might be very minor and not happen at all. So hence why in a harm reduction manner, we should always circle back to people need to check their markers of health on a regular basis to see how they react to the drugs. To make sure that they can monitor their health and make the appropriate decisions in terms of how to mitigate the side effects moving forward. So if anabolic steroids are increasing your blood pressure and you have elevated blood pressure for months and years on end, that can increase the likelihood that you will experience kidney damage and that you will then have a problem with your kidneys that continues years down the line. Anabolic steroids can increase your bad or LDL cholesterol and decrease your good or HDL. If you're running blind and not observing that through blood work, you might have no idea that that's occurring. And in general, the longer time you go with an elevated LDL or bad cholesterol and a decreased HDL or good cholesterol, the higher the likelihood that you could experience that in itself is a marker of cardiovascular disease. So increase the likelihood that you could have a buildup of plaque. Again, in your arteries, but again, that happens if you take high dosages of long period of time and living with a atypical cholesterol profile for long periods of time. So you need to know if that is happening so that you can then do your best supplementally and nutritionally to mitigate that problem. And anabolic steroids, and in particular certain anabolic steroids like boldenone, can increase your hematocrit, which is a red blood cell count. And an elevated red blood cell count can increase the likelihood of blood clots and also kidney damage as well. And you might not know that is happening to you unless you get the blood work. So that is why the most important thing is harm reduction, where people need to be educated that, and this is expensive. You not only need to be able to afford the drugs, you need to then afford good nutrition. You then be able to then afford supplements that you can use to help aid in your health, aid in your cholesterol profile, aid in reducing naturally potentially your blood pressure, all that, etc. And you need to then do the appropriate medical checks on a regular basis and have your blood work done on a regular basis and pay for that. And I think it would be much better if we know if young men are using anabolic steroids that they could potentially get some of those services for free and then have people interpret those results who are educated and well known, because you can't be an expert on everything. And so, you might be looking at a blood panel and not really know how to interpret the results or what to do to make those results go in a more favorable manner for your health. And so you need to, before you even start steroids, know what the markers are, what an elevated bad cholesterol looks like, and what you could do to work on that in that regard. And so that's why harm reduction should be. I mean, at the end of the day, and especially in the United Kingdom, the possession of anabolic steroids is legal. It's only buying and selling and manufacturing them. So buying, selling, and manufacturing them is illegal, but possession is not criminalized. And if you have decided to make the decision to use anabolic steroids, that's a personal choice. But the best thing that we can do as a society is to educate people on the safest way to use them and make sure that people understand the consequences and go into it with a mature decision and know what to do if things start to go wrong. And I think that's the best way that we can do moving forward. It would be great, in Wales anyway. I know there are some steroid clinics where specifically on certain evenings, so these medical clinics will have the ability for targeting guys and inviting guys who use anabolic steroids to go, so they can actually get scans of their hearts and ECG, so you could see, has my heart hypertrophied, and do I have thickening of the left ventricle, which is potentially going to increase my risk of cardiovascular complications.
Right.
Am I having an irregular heartbeat? As my liver enlarged? Is my kidney damaged? Scans, that's the kind of information people need to be able to expose to see, so that they can then make the appropriate decisions on how to mitigate the side effects as time passes. Because the longer that they go on with an elevated blood pressure, elevated bad cholesterol, elevated hematocrit, etc., the higher the likelihood that long-term kidney and liver damage occurs. However, if they know that these things are occurring, they can then mitigate them, and then make sure they use them in the what would be regarded the safest way possible.
I completely agree. It's like, why not give the education and the resources? Because otherwise, you're pretty much leaving people blind. And it's like, what are the chances that all the steroid users are going to do this much research and then figure out exactly what they need to do, apply it to their context? Like, some people might not just be willing to make that decision, but they want the result. So it's like, okay, they're going to make the short-term result. Like, people make horrible decisions. And with this, it's like, if we can give them an easier way to get the education, that would obviously be fantastic. And it's like, people are going to do it anyway, especially in the UK where it's legal. It's like, here in New Zealand, it's like you're taking a big leap, but there it's like it's seeming almost like common.
I think in the UK especially, education is imperative to making sure that these people can use these drugs in the safest way possible, especially if we know statistically usage is increasing. And there is no centralized source of information for anabolic steroids, so where people have to go out of their way on their own to find this information, and that's when they can be left astray and be misinformed, and so they need to be very diligent about educating themselves prior. And anabolic steroids as well, in terms of where you're buying them from, is an issue, because underground labs or UGLs are probably the most common form of anabolic steroid used. Yeah. And that's not a pharmaceutical drug. They are there's no guaranteed quality control that the anabolic steroid that you're buying and the dosage you believe it is indeed that. There's a lot of, you can get people that take the drugs and then get their blood work done, and then they get some indication of what they're like. And William Llewellyn and the anabolics, the guy that wrote the anabolics book, actually has a drug test kit. So you can actually, and this is targeted primarily at Americans, where the underground scene is where most people get their anabolic steroids. Right. Because the only way you can get them in America is via prescription, and possession is criminalized. But you can actually buy a kit from William Llewellyn and actually test your drugs to see if they are indeed the drug they say they are, which is quite important. And he's actually just released one for growth hormone as well. And so that's quite an important thing. But I mean, in the United Kingdom as well, you don't have to use underground steroids, because you can fly to another country. You could fly to Greece, you could fly to Turkey, you could fly to Thailand, you could buy anabolic steroids in a pharmacy from a registered pharmaceutical company, like testosterone from a registered pharmaceutical company. So you're guaranteed that it's what is on the label is what is inside it, what the drug actually is in terms of dosage, that it's made in a sterile environment. So that decreases the likelihood that you could get an infection or an abscess occurring. And the purity is guaranteed. And so you can then bring those back with you in terms of possession and use them, and that way you're safeguarding yourself against the potential problems of using underground steroids. So people can then also decide to make that decision as well. I don't know if you heard of a guy called the Bodybuilder in Thailand. Have you ever heard of that guy? I
saw that. Yeah.
So did you see what happened with him and how he
not particularly
had so he it was a few months ago now. It basically used dirty gear, and from an injection in his quad, developed a really severe infection. But this is in South America, so he was then treated in South America, and he thought at some point he was going to lose his leg, and he had to do a GoFundMe account to pay for the surgery because he didn't have health insurance to save his leg and have the abscess cleaned out.
Yeah.
And he believes that was because of unsterile anabolic steroids.
Right.
So that's always a risk that could happen. That's a very extreme example, very, very extreme example. And there's thousands of people that use underground steroids and don't experience that issue.
Yeah.
But that issue is theoretically possible.
There, and
it's theoretically possible, and then that could just be eliminated if it used pharmaceutical grade stuff. But that's more expensive, more of a pain to get. But that's a decision that you then have to make. But if we're talking in a harm reduction context, then as a generic statement, it would be better to use pharmaceutical grade stuff than underground stuff, and then that's a decision somebody can make.
Yeah, and then there is one more thing I'd like to touch on. And let me know if you don't want to cover this because it is relatively controversial. I'd like to touch on the whole issue of transgender men transitioning to females. So now they're a transgender female. I hope I've got that terminology correct. If you've trained either with anabolics or without anabolics as a male, will that carry over? And do we know with the current research, does that carry over to females? So for instance, if you go and compete in bodybuilding as a female or MMA as a female, all those sort of things, does that carry over? Is that a major sort of issue?
So we don't. So the first one is that if a male just is an anabolic steroid user and then they stop taking anabolic steroids, and they then go and want to compete in a drug tested federation, we don't know to what extent the benefits are retained. As the previous mouse study I said, for 10% of the mice's lifespan, the myonuclei numbers remained elevated after anabolic steroid exposure. And the best guess we have currently in the literature for humans is that myonuclei last for 15 years.
Right.
And so even if a previous anabolic steroid user is maintaining high numbers of myonuclei, we don't know quantitatively how much of a performance benefit years down the line that could give them. In theory, they would have a benefit, but that theory is derived from the fact that if you have high numbers of myonuclei, your protein synthetic rate inside your muscle will always be higher. So your chance for recoverability would always be higher, and your propensity for muscle growth in theory would always be higher because you have more nuclei. However, you'd still have to take advantage of that in a sense that you'd have to still train hard and eat correctly to be able to see any benefit. And as time passes on, you're getting older anyway, it's at a significant time, you're subjected to the decline in satellite cell number, and you're still going to be subjected from the age-related decline in muscle growth anyway. So we don't know in humans how long of a benefit it's going on for. I mean, even if people are maintaining high numbers of myonuclei post-steroid usage, we still don't know actually what performance increment and benefit that actually causes. You'd have to do performance testing to quantitatively answer that question. That's never been conducted. In terms of biological men who undergo transition to become a female, and so they're transgender, there's been no studies where someone in that regard has been monitored through time, so you can investigate what performance, what happens to performance, what happens to muscle mass, on hormonal profiles. There's some information on that, but not in a sporting context. So that data has to be collected to truly know. But at the moment, you can at the Olympics compete as a transgender woman, but your testosterone level has to be lowered below, I believe it's 5 nanomoles. I forget the exact number, but it has to be lowered below a certain number for a certain period of time. And once you've declared that you're transitioning gender, you then can't go back. And I believe you have to also have your hormone values monitored for a significant period of time to prove that indeed you have been under that value for a period of time. But I mean, we're only talking about testosterone here. But if you were born and lived the first 20, 30 years of your life in a high testosterone environment and you're masculinized, then there's certain parts of your physiology that might not change even if your testosterone lowers. So your bone density might be higher, your shoulders might be broader, you might just be taller, your hands might be bigger. Men have differences in sort of spatial awareness compared to women in some tests that can be conducted, and we don't know if that's being maintained during transition. But then again, the question comes there is in some sports, having broad shoulders and big hands and tall height and maintaining that as you become a female, compete against other females in sport, that's an advantage. Yep. In some other sports, that's a disadvantage. And so it becomes kind of sport dependent in some regards.
Very subjective.
And in the Olympics anyway, they want to uphold the idea of equality and that everyone should be able to compete, irrespective of age, race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity. Everyone should have the ability to be able to compete at the highest level. And so more research has got to be done on people transitioning gender to fully confirm what happens in terms of performance increases if you're a female becoming a male or decreases if you're a male becoming a female. And it would be very interesting if you measured, for example, like some of those traits like bone density, lung volume, hand size, shoulder girdle width of the population of men that become women, and then compare those metrics to a population of women, and then see, are they actually significantly different? Yep. And then in theory, could that then give them an advantage? Because say you're a man and you become a woman and your lung volume is then bigger on average than women, and that's like proven scientifically, then that's something that has to be factored in, right? And then it'll be very interesting to know how much muscle mass is lost during that time. As you're a man and you become a woman, as your testosterone goes down and your estrogen goes up, and what happens to your strength, what happens to your cardiovascular performance, quantified by VO2 max, etc., etc.
Yes.
So
there's a lot of variables that play.
There's a lot of variables that play. Yes, and you could view it on two sides, where the people that are transitioning gender might say it's unfair that they're not included. Yeah. But then the people that are receiving that person into their category might also view it as unfair. I don't know if you saw recently the USAPL. I saw there was a man transitioned to a woman, and they've come out with a recent policy saying that they are not going to accept people that transitioned from male into female to compete in their powerlifting federation. Yeah.
Personally, I think that's a reasonable judgment until we know the research, until we know exactly what's going on. It's sort of, I think it's always a touchy topic. Many people. It's a very touchy topic. There's not many people doing this, Exactly, yeah. This is a minority of people, and it's not like we're seeing them all at the podium of the Olympics. Yeah, that's the thing. So it's like we've got to. There's a lot of context to this, and it's like it cannot be answered just by and then you put a little equation and you sort of figure it out. It's like it's very, very context dependent.
Needs to be a monitoring of a cohort of people that transition through time with as many metrics in terms of performance, hormones, muscle mass occurring, comparisons of their final body characteristics deep into their transition compared to the group they transition into, to fully understand this question. Muscle memory is only a small aspect in this regard. I'd be more in what, even if your myonuclei numbers are elevated, lose muscle mass as you transition from a man, a large amount of your muscle mass as you transition from a man to a woman because of the decrease in testosterone and elevation in estrogen. And the transition is stressful, no doubt stressful, and you're probably not going to be adhering to the most optimal lifestyle.
Yes, exactly.
To maintaining and growing muscle mass anyway. So
there's a lot of
there's a lot of stuff that's got to be looked into. But I mean, it's not just that. It's lung volume. It's bone density. There's a large number of hand size. Yeah, all those things that can make a difference in certain sports, like MMA, need to be investigated. And maybe it would be, and the sporting federations just have to decide what they do until some data is released. Yeah. and roll with it until, it could take a decade until there's a better way to incorporate them. And maybe what now is not what will be decided in 10 years' time. But given the current scenario, it might be the best thing to do. But it depends on the individual sport authority and what they want to do, doesn't it, really? I mean, you're in New Zealand, aren't you?
Yeah.
And, I mean, have you heard of Laurel Hubbard?
I have not.
So, I mean, Laurel Hubbard is a transgender. She was a man. She's now a woman, and she came second at the World Weightlifting Championships.
Right.
Believe it was in 2017. She came second to Sarah Robles, and she received some incredible backlash against her competing, even though she adhered to the rules of the IWF and the rules of the International Olympic Committee in terms of how long her testosterone had to be decreased for. But some people are just saying, no, it's inherently wrong in a strength sport that you have someone that was a man compete as a woman. And there's reports of her being booed and having,
that's the kind of behavior that's a bit like, okay, she tried everything in her like, she's done everything in her power to do the right thing, and maybe it's wrong that she's competing. Maybe it is. We don't know, but
it's not helping the situation.
Yeah, like they're not the problem. Like the problem is the regulation. Maybe we had to just say blanket statement: if you're transitioning until we know you can't compete, or you have to compete in a separate category, or whatever. And I mean, personally, I see the point for like equality and inclusion, but it's like when it's an unfair advantage in sport, to me it's unfair. And then it's like, if there could be an extra rationale to transition because of that, maybe that's a BS argument. But yeah, I think, but it's like, I don't like.
I think you'd have to be of a certain psychological predisposition to just want to transition.
Yeah, like that's
to compete.
You have to really want to like commit your whole life to that and be okay with, if it's fraudulent, doing it fraudulently. So it's like, okay, that's a lot to, but yeah, I think
and that's a decision that you're not going to be able to reverse. So
and
but I mean, with Laurel Hubbard, she went to the Commonwealth Games in the Gold Coast in Australia in 2018 April, and she was pretty much a guaranteed gold medalist in her category in weightlifting, and I believe she dislocated her elbow during the opening snatches, and so she had to withdraw from the competition. And you can read some of these news reports of people saying, "Oh, she deserved that," and it sounds like the auditorium in Australia wasn't too pleased with her being there, and some coaches were very vocal.
Well, I can see why, and I think we shouldn't. I don't think we should ever argue for people to be.
No. But my point, just to continue that story, is that that was supposedly potentially career-ending injury for her. Yeah. But actually, she seems to be
responded in that way.
I know, and this is a potentially career-ending injury. You wouldn't wish that on any person.
No, it's like you've worked your whole life to get there, and then you had this personal struggle, and then it's like it's been ended, and people cheered that it ended. That's fucked up.
But she is, from what I've read, is recovering and is hoping to make a run to go to Tokyo 2020. However, I saw that article a few months ago, and I don't know, because there's an unbelievable task to get qualified as an Olympic weightlifter to go to the Olympics, because you have to compete in a certain number of drug-tested competitions prior. You have to qualify for your nation. Your nation has to be allowed in, and it's very difficult. Yeah. But that she could be the first transgender woman that we see at the Olympics. So
I mean,
sure, if that happens for you in New Zealand, you'll hear about it.
Yeah, like, I mean, personally, I'm more on the side of sort of, okay, I get equality, but like, almost just saying tough. Like, if it's unfair on people who are doing it, like, if they could have any sort of advantage, personally, I think it's sort of.
We need to scientifically know quantitatively how much the advantage is, and is that then deemed to be too much of an advantage? And it may be that it's sport specific. It may be that in strength sports
it's just too much, or maybe
the advantage is carried over and is too much based on a 2-year reduction in hormone levels. So maybe it has to be a 5-year or more reduction in hormone levels.
Yes, and something like MMA, it's like.
And maybe an MMA with the argument of bone density and ham size and lung volume, it may be that in terms of the health of people higher likely to cycling or other things, that maybe for the health of everyone involved, that might not be what should be best and should be a separate category.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, what about is the Olympics? If you're talking about a transgender person who wants to play table tennis or do archery, that's different. And
Yes,
maybe
exactly.
every sport should have a different policy compared to Olympic weightlifting, compared to boxing, compared to judo,
like, I think there's
etc.
a lot of places we can rule lines, but I think it has to be sport dependent, because it's like you get something like powerlifting, and it's like obviously men lift more weights than women. Like they're stronger than women. Does that carry over? We need to know that. But it's like for table tennis, that is a skill sport. Maybe men have inherent advantages in table tennis, but we don't know that. Obviously, real tennis or big tennis is men have advantages in that. But it's like, does that carry over to table tennis? We need to know that sort of thing. And I think, and then it's like maybe that could be the judgment. Maybe it could be if there's no gender advantage, then maybe it's fine. Maybe we need a whole separate category. But then does that even leave them with enough competitors? So it's like, that's a huge. There's a lot of things to take into account there. But it's like I hate the argument where people just say, "Hey, you're not going for equality if you say they can't compete." I think that's bullshit, frankly, because it's like other things are on the line rather than righteousness.
I mean, the fair way to say that they are not to be included is because we have scientific data showing that the performance advantages that are carried over are indeed too great for it to deem to be fair to the category they transition into.
Yeah, but personally, I think that should come before the research, not after. Because it's like, what are the consequences of the people they're competing against? And say, we can't get the research yet. Say if we don't have the available population, say blah, blah, blah. It's like, if we can assume theoretically that they have advantages, that's unfair. And that's like obviously something we need to, and it's like, it's so complex that it's like, and especially.
But then that's a decision of the sport authorities.
Exactly,
They might deem the theoretical advantage yet to be quantified to be deemed to be too high, and therefore it's a no from the get go. Whereas now it's an inclusion from the get go, and data will inevitably manipulate that outcome in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and it's just like, and I think it's good that I think it should be the authorities' point, but it's like for someone, I can't remember her name. Was it Sophie, the New Zealander?
The weightlifter that I was talking about, Laurel Hubbard.
Laurel Hubbard, yeah. For someone like her, it's like we obviously shouldn't boo them. It's like that's ridiculous because they've been allowed into the sport. It's like, okay, if you think it's unfair, that's fine, but it's like sportsmanship that still exists.
Bring it up against the IWF.
Yeah,
don't
ask them.
The International Weightlifting Federation, the people that are allowing her to compete, and she's just obeying the rules and is following them. And
it's
then
not like they're doing some shady shit to get around the rules.
No,
exactly. So it's like there's no reason to hate on them, which is frankly ridiculous. But it's like, why not just do? Like, it's like if they're following the rules, I don't see an issue with what they're doing. But it's like maybe them competing is dangerous or is unfair. So it's like, we need to take that into account. And there's a lot more that needs to be learnt. But
I mean, there's other very successful transgender athletes, but from what I understand, there's another one called Tiffany Albaru. I think I've butchered her last name, but she's a Brazilian volleyball player. And I think those two could be the ones that we see going to the Olympics potentially.
Yes.
I mean, this is a very, very dynamic situation.
There's a lot of variables to take into account.
I don't know if you've seen that this week right now that we're having this podcast in late February. There's a South African sprinter called Caster Semenya,
right?
And she's intersex, which means that she has high circulating testosterone levels, but is a female. And there used to be the ruling that if you had a high testosterone level as a female, you had to take drugs to reduce that.
Right.
And then that was overturned by a sprinter called Duchu Chan that took the Athletics Federation to the Court of Arbitration of Sport, who then deemed that it was unethical, and they had to have evidence to prove that high testosterone levels in these people are actually performance enhancing.
Yeah.
And they conducted some research where they measured the testosterone levels of females at world athletics championships and the Pan Arab Games, and basically showed that if you break them into different quartiles, the women who are in the highest quartile for testosterone actually end up winning more medals and perform better between 1% to 4% in certain events.
Yeah.
And so they then decided that they are going to reinstigate the rules to make women lower their testosterone levels. However, Caster Semenya has taken that ruling to the Court of Arbitration of Sport, and now this week it's being decided about whether or not that should be allowed.
Right. So it's
which
very...
is pretty controversial as well.
Yes,
yes,
yes.
it's a very hot topic, where these are the people that are born this way, then being told they have to take drugs to
Yeah. That's a bit like... That's sort of...
I mean...
It's
very
I can imagine
touchy
that would be
subject.
quite painful for them, because it's like, okay, this is just how I'm born. I've been given this genetic gift. Now I have
Yes.
to stunt myself because this marker is out, when it's like other people might have other advantages that you cannot measure through blood work, for instance, longer limbs, whatever.
Muscle fiber type, lung
exactly.
volume.
It's like, are we going to reduce those too?
Blood
Like,
capillarization.
yeah,
no,
that's
exactly.
the thing. Like, I don't really like if that's how you naturally are. I see no issue with that. But I mean, I get the point. We're trying to keep it equal, but it's like I think in sport, a lot of it, especially in something like sprinting, is we're trying to find the height of human achievement, and it's like that doesn't come through stunting people just because they have genetic gifts. It's like, but I do get the point. But yeah, I mean, it's so complex. You need to know all the details and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think we'll leave it here. Where can people find you? Contact you for the research, all that sort of stuff.
So Alex_K_T on Instagram, you'll find a post. I've made a specific account just for the advertisement for the research for our March 16, 17 and April 13, 14, 15 biopsy sessions.
Yep.
You'll find my academic email on there. You can then email me, and if you're genuinely interested and are available, then I will arrange a phone call with you and we can discuss your visit. And anyone in the UK, definitely. And if you're in Europe as well, potentially, we might be able to get you involved.
Fantastic. Cool. Is there anything else you wanted to pimp? Like a personal Instagram or anything like that?
No, the main thing I'm concentrating at the moment for is just finding people for the study.
Cool.
So,
Fantastic.
I mean, even if you can't take part, I mean, I just greatly appreciate it if you shared the advert on your social media or told a friend. The more people that could hear about it, the better in our regard in finding people.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the Student Side Hustle. I would appreciate so much if you would leave a review if you'd like to hear more of what I'm saying. Then I would love if you would follow me on Instagram or check out my other social media, all linked in the show notes. And again, I would just like to say thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful evening and study hard.